All right, we're here, the last video of the last week of class. We've all been through a lot this term. I've already covered a lot of material so far today, focusing on international responses. I think this arguably connects most directly to a lot of international relations classes that you've probably taken as ANU students studying international relations, but I wanted to try to take a step back and reach some conclusions. I know this week it's kind of like trying to put 10 pounds of rice in a 5-pound bag, but I think you can come back to this later if you don't have time. I think for me, it's important to try to recognize the water that we've come through, the assumptions that we have, the research that we've covered, the case studies that we've seen, to try to better understand what our position is in the world, the governments that often represent us in international arenas, and the kind of trends that we've seen in the past might hint towards the kind of challenges that we're going to see in the future. I think this class has been motivated by several fundamental questions. How can environmental scarcity or abundance affect human security and conflict? Why do state and non-state actors use violence to further their goals? And why do individuals choose violence? And we tried to place all of the answers to these questions in a systematic framework according to different assumptions about who the relative actors are, what structural or strategic factors are involved, and how the different levels of analysis, the governments and the individuals within them, interconnect with each other. I structured the class in which we had the first part of the term defining actors, their interests, the terms that we would use over the course of the term, the second section, and the initial most influential explanations for the causes of conflict. The second section focused on environmental and social factors that are connected to those underlying political, economic, and structural factors in the first part of the class. And then these last 2 weeks are starting to connect it to governments' domestic and international responses to these kind of violent challenges. We focused on the extremes, the largest challenges to governmental stability with civil war, and the most dramatic individual impacts, human survival and basic scarcity, though all of these can be placed on continuums and look at less extreme impacts of environmental factors or political institutions. But by focusing on the extremes, that highlights the most dramatic challenges that states might reasonably face and the individual responses to them. I've included a number of specific individual case studies as well. The theories are often comparative, quantitative, deductive, and theoretical, and I tried to balance that with specific case studies to see how individual cases these factors can or maybe have limited explanatory power to explaining these outcomes, from Burundi's political violence, Venezuela's resource curse, dam construction and displacement in Mali, climate refugees in the U.S., the dramatic heat dome that happened in the Middle East and is now ongoing in South Asia now in parts of the U.S. and Europe, South Sudan's oil fields and their impact on security and economic growth, transnational land pressures in the Omo River Valley, the Turkana area between Kenya and Ethiopia, and then international efforts to try to encourage cooperation related to natural resources with the Kimberley process and the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. We talked about land degradation in the Sahel, conflict and disasters in after tsunamis in Indonesia, water fractionalization, the soccer war over migration in Latin America, Syria's war and drought, a number of students are writing their papers on, Australian and American climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts, often related to the military, Nepal's response to a changing climate and international coordination just in the Arctic that I talked about just now. A lot of different cases, and I think it shows the wide applicability of a lot of the topics that we focused on in the class and the importance of trying to narrow down this large, complex, multi-stage tapestry that we painted over 12 weeks in trying to narrow our focus, knowing the larger state of play and the system and the actors involved, to be able to look at individual pieces, and that connects directly to the articles that we read and the papers that my students write at the end of the term. As part of this class, I've also tried to integrate a number of practical pedagogical lessons and excuses for students to practice developing their skills through trying to read academic articles in an effective yet thorough way by looking for the theoretical contribution, how large the substantive effects that they're talking about in their paper, and the structure that often our authors use in structuring their essays, from the introduction, literature review, the argument that addresses a research question deriving from the literature, the observable implications of the argument in testable hypotheses, explaining how the research was conducted, what the results are, how you can conduct robustness checks to make sure that the conclusions you reach are not just because of some idiosyncratic part of the data that you have or the case study that you selected, to see how robust the findings actually are, and then conclusions, policy implications, and areas for future research. I think this is a structure I often recommend students in my classes take, because it has a lot of purchase in a number of different fields for what the scientific process includes and how we can do science in ways that are robust and that can stand up to scrutiny, or applying it to different cases. And it all comes down to clear thinking, having a clear question and a clear answer, or a series of answers that you think address that question, and then going out in the world and testing it. There's also a couple of common challenges with that kind of approach when thinking theoretically about a particular outcomes. I mentioned 3 over the course of the class. Endogeneity, the fact that 2 factors can cause each other, that you might look at it in one particular side or direction and you might overlook the reciprocal effect. For example, declining resource rents can cause conflict, and the possibility of conflict can also reduce resource rents, because companies will shut down their mines, or governments won't be able to control areas where the mining happens. That can reduce rents. Spuriousness is when some outside factor causes both your outcome that you are talking about and the factor that you care about. For example, government weakness can cause both a reliance on natural resource rents and increased conflict risk, because governments aren't stable enough to be able to try to help diversify the economy, and so they depend on one particular resource that can't move. And also weak governments can increase conflict risk because they aren't able to take care of their citizens' needs. And the last main kind of question that is often asked of a lot of the research to try to see how strong it can stand up to scrutiny is the level versus change question. Is it levels of resource rents matter, for example, or is it spikes or dips in that rent? Is it the level of development that a country has, or how much that development has changed from previous years, like in the Venezuela case, or compared to other countries? In 1960, the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Korea had roughly the same GDP. You've seen dramatic changes over the last 70 years between those 2 different countries, and that could cause some dissatisfaction in the country that's not keeping up with who they might consider their peers. Over the course of the semester, I've also tried to hammer the importance of trying to describe your arguments in different ways, often to try to simplify it as much as possible, to be clear about what you're arguing and what you're not. I often come back to this graph from the Homer-Dixon article that we read back in like week 1 or week 2 of the term, because it does kind of include the major elements of this class: the background sources of environmental scarcity, how that scarcity affects human security and people's movements, and how that can affect political stability. And I think that is kind of a snapshot and a way that you can include a whole host of complexity in a kind of simplified reality, but one that can help spur other elements of research. Homer-Dixon's approach also was important for trying to understand the sources of the scarcity through shrinking the resource pie through environmental change, dividing it up into smaller slices due to population growth and population pressures, or the unequal redistribution when certain groups or people get larger portions of the pie as motivations for potential conflict. Human security threats. Again, I'm trying to just touch on the major themes of the class in this video, but we've covered a lot of them. And it connects to the previous video in the critique of Gleditsch and Norda of the IPCC report, that often people will talk about human security without concretely talking about what part of human security or the human experience that they're talking about. Is it economic, politically focused, having to do with food, health, environment, personal physical security or community security? There's a whole host of different factors, and when you're talking in your final papers for this class or other classes, it's important to potentially frame whatever you care about within these larger debates of human security, but being able to actually say, okay, there's a whole host of elements that go into it. I'm just focusing on one. And here's why. Here's the costs and the benefits of that approach. The major kind of explanations that Homer-Dixon outlined in a number of the different articles implicitly or explicitly focused on. Simple scarcity wars, just basic scarcity can lead to conflict. Group identity conflict caused by population movements, or deprivation, economic deprivation and disruption could potentially lead to conflict. Climate change and conflict. There's a whole host of different potential theoretical links. Climate change is an overall threat multiplier of existing drivers for instability. There's no evidence that it is a necessary or sufficient condition yet. It is often the interactive effect that climate factors have with the economic, political, and social factors that we've talked about over the course of the term. Environmental conditions, as Selene concludes, by themselves cannot predict violent outbreaks. So in some ways, this is critiquing the kind of Malthusian approach and kind of not quite cornucopian, but basically saying the evidence is not in yet, and that people are talking about scarcities of a level and extent to which it hasn't driven the conflict that we've seen so far. We've also talked about ways of trying to mitigate and to adapt from the domestic framework or an international response, which we talked about there. Since I've all touched them, I'm not going to dwell on them that much, but I think the domestic and international responses are often tied to understanding what the problem is. Like with the IPCC reports, understanding what the impacts of a changing climate, a changing political climate, a changing economic climate is crucial to developing policies that respond to what the interests are of the relevant actors. And then in order to have concrete and effective responses, you have to understand what the problems are, who are the affected populations, and what is likely to bring about the change that various actors are likely to want or to not want. So that generally is the overall scope of the class, how you can conceptualize the different elements that we've covered so far in the class and kind of see the broader tapestry for how political and social science has grappled with the issues and the challenges that your generation is likely to have to deal with going forward in the future, and that mine and other generations have grappled with in previous decades. With that, thank you for a great semester. I hope you have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, a wonderful year, and I will see you or not. Thank you. See you.